Marine husband exposes wife's 20-year affair and confronts her affair partner. Adrian Mitchell had spent most of his life serving his country. He was a Marine, disciplined and focused, always putting others before himself. After decades of commitment, he was finally ready to enjoy a peaceful retirement. Home was supposed to be his sanctuary, a place where he could rest, reconnect with his wife Lila, and start a new chapter. But life doesn't always follow the plan. It all started with little things, subtle changes in Lila's behavior that Adrian couldn't quite put his finger on. She was distant, distracted, always busy with work. For years, Adrian brushed it off, thinking maybe it was just the strain of daily life. After all, they've been married for over 30 years, and in any long marriage, there are ups and downs. Still, something felt off. Deep down, Adrian knew, but he never thought it could be this bad. One evening, while at a retreat for veterans, Adrian met a man named Sam. Sam was different, kind but direct, with a story of his own about betrayal. It was through Sam that Adrian learned the truth about his own life. Sam handed him a report, detailed and undeniable. Inside were the cold, hard facts of Lila's affair, a secret relationship with her boss, Ethan, that had been going on for over 20 years. Adrian's world came crashing down. This wasn't just a fling or a moment of weakness. This was a long-term betrayal that had been happening right under his nose for 2 decades. His mind raced. How could she? Why would she? The man who had survived war zones now found himself in a battle he never expected. A battle for the truth, for his dignity, and for justice. Adrian couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. After all those years of loyalty and sacrifice, the man who had faced the most dangerous situations in the world was now left facing something even more terrifying: uncertainty at home. At first, it was the late-night work calls. Lila had always been dedicated to her job, but over the past few years, her extra hours have become more frequent. Then there were the mysterious text messages, the sudden excuses to leave the house for meetings that didn't add up. And whenever Adrian asked, she'd dismiss it as stress or a rough patch at work. For a while, he believed her. After all, why wouldn't he? But deep down, his instincts, the same ones that had kept him alive in combat, were sounding the alarm. One day, while Lila was at work, Adrian sat at the kitchen table, his mind racing. He replayed every little moment from the last few months. Something was going on, but he didn't know what. He needed answers, but he didn't want to confront her without any proof. He couldn't, he wouldn't, accuse her of something so devastating without being sure. That's when Sam entered his life. Sam, a fellow veteran, had been through his own storm of betrayal. They met during a weekend retreat for military men who had struggled to adjust to civilian life. Adrian liked Sam right away. He was direct, honest, and had no time for pretending everything was okay when it wasn't. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Sam opened up about his own marriage, a relationship that had crumbled when he discovered his wife's affair. His voice was steady, but there was a sadness in his eyes that Adrian recognized immediately. They didn't need to say much. They understood each other's pain without words. Then Sam said something that made Adrian's heart stop. "Adrian, I think there's something you need to know about your wife." Adrian's stomach churned. He wasn't ready for this, but the truth was coming, whether he wanted it or not. The next day, Sam handed Adrian a report. "Read this," Sam said quietly. Adrian took it, his hands shaking slightly as he held the envelope. "I'm sorry, brother, but you deserve to know." Alone in his truck, parked on a quiet road, Adrian opened the report. His eyes scanned the pages, and as the words sank in, the weight of them crushed him. It was all there in black and white. The affair had started over 20 years ago. 2 decades of lies. It wasn't just some fling, some passing temptation. No, this was a full-blown secret relationship with Ethan, her boss. There were dates, hotel bookings, vacations he never knew about. Adrian felt sick as he realized that so much of their life together, moments he cherished, had been built on a lie. It was as if time stood still. His world, the one he thought he knew, had shattered into a million pieces in front of him. He couldn't breathe. How could this be real? The woman he loved, the person he had trusted more than anyone, had been betraying him for more than half their marriage. She had lied to him every day, year after year, looking him in the eyes while living another life behind his back. Adrian slammed the report shut, anger boiling inside him. He had faced enemies on the battlefield, but this was different. This wasn't a fight he could win with strength or strategy. This was personal. This was his heart being ripped out by the one person he thought he could always count on. He sat there for hours, the weight of the betrayal crushing him. How could she do this? After everything they'd been through, how could she keep this from him for so long? His mind raced with questions. but there were no answers, at least not yet. Later that night, Adrian drove home numb. The house felt different now, like it wasn't really his anymore. Everything reminded him of the lies, every piece of furniture, every photo on the wall. He couldn't escape the memories, now tainted by the truth he had uncovered. As he lay in bed next to Lila, who slept soundly, Adrian stared at the ceiling, wide awake. He wasn't ready to confront her yet, but he knew he couldn't wait long. The truth was out there now, and there was no going back. His life would never be the same again. The man who had stood strong in the face of danger now felt completely lost. How do you fight back when the enemy is someone you love? How do you heal from a wound that cuts so deep it leaves scars you can't see? Adrian didn't have the answers yet, but one thing was clear. He couldn't keep living like this. He couldn't pretend everything was fine when his world had been torn apart. It was time to face the truth. And when the time came, he would confront Lila and Ethan with everything he knew. Adrian had never felt so conflicted in his entire life. He had faced down enemies in combat zones, pushed himself to the limit through years of military service, and survived more than most people could imagine. But nothing prepared him for the battle he was about to face in his own home. He had spent days trying to figure out how to confront Lila, replaying every possible scenario in his mind. Part of him wanted to scream, to let his anger explode, to make her feel the pain she had caused him. But another part, the part that had always controlled his emotions under pressure, told him to stay calm. He needed to know why. Why had she done this? How could she have kept something like this from him for so long? It was a quiet Saturday morning when Adrian finally decided it was time. He couldn't carry this burden any longer. He had spent enough nights lying next to her, staring at the ceiling, wondering how long she had been living this double life. He got up early, brewed a pot of coffee, and sat at the kitchen table, waiting for her to wake up. Lila came downstairs, yawning and stretching, completely unaware of what was about to happen. She smiled when she saw him sitting there, her usual morning routine, but Adrian didn't smile back. "Sit down," he said, his voice calm but firm. There was no anger, no shouting, just a simple command. Lila hesitated, confused by the tone of his voice, but she sat across from him, her smile fading as she saw the serious look on his face. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice uncertain. Adrian took a deep breath. His heart was pounding in his chest, but his mind was clear. He had rehearsed this moment in his head 1,000 times, but now that it was here, the words felt heavy in his mouth. "I know about you and Ethan," he said, watching her face closely. For a split second, there was nothing, just silence. Lila blinked, her mouth opening slightly as if she didn't understand what he was saying. Then the realization hit her, and her face turned pale. What are you talking about?" she stammered, her voice shaky. Adrian held up the report Sam had given him, placing it on the table between them. I know everything, Lila, the affair, the lies, 20 years of it." Lila's eyes darted to the report, her hands trembling slightly. She didn't reach for it. Instead, she looked up at Adrian, her eyes wide with panic. I can explain," she said, but the words sounded hollow even to her. Adrian shook his head slowly. "Explain? How do you explain 20 years of betrayal? How do you explain living 2 lives? Tell me, Lila. Tell me how you've been able to look me in the eyes every day, knowing what you've done." Tears welled up in her eyes, but Adrian didn't feel any sympathy. Not now, not after everything. He had loved her with everything he had, and she had repaid him with lies and deceit. "I didn't mean for it to go on this long," Lila whispered, her voice breaking. It just happened. I didn't know how to stop." Adrian's hands tightened around the edge of the table. "You didn't know how to stop. You had 2 decades to stop. You had every opportunity to come clean, to tell me the truth, but you didn't. You chose to keep lying." Lila wiped at her tears, but they kept coming. "I'm sorry, Adrian. I never wanted to hurt you. I never meant for it to turn into this." "Sorry?" Adrian's voice was cold now, sharp with bitterness. "You're sorry? After 20 years, that's all you have to say? Sorry doesn't cut it, Lila. Not this time." For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of Lila's quiet sobs. Adrian sat there, watching the woman he had shared his life with crumble in front of him, but he couldn't feel the sympathy he once would have. His heart had been hardened by the truth. He pushed back his chair and stood up, towering over her. "You've lied to me for 20 years. You've made me feel like a fool. And now you want to say sorry? That's not enough. Not even close." Lila buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with sobs. Adrian watched her for a moment, his mind racing. Part of him wanted to turn and walk out the door, to leave her behind and never look back. But he couldn't. Not yet. There was still one more person he needed to deal with. "I'm going to see Ethan," Adrian said, his voice low but full of determination. Lila's head shut up, her eyes wide with fear. Adrian, no, please don't. But Adrian had already made up his mind. I'm not going to do anything stupid, Lila, but he's going to know exactly what kind of man he's been. He's going to feel the weight of what he's done. With that, Adrian turned and walked out the door, leaving Lila sobbing at the kitchen table. His heart was heavy, but his mind was clear. He knew what he had to do next. This wasn't just about Lila's betrayal anymore. This was about confronting the man who had played a part in destroying his life. As Adrian got into his truck and drove towards Ethan's office, he felt a strange sense of calm. He wasn't sure what he would say when he got there, but he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going to let Ethan walk away from this without facing the consequences. This wasn't about revenge. It was about justice, and Adrian was going to make sure that, one way or another, the truth was out, and there was no escaping it. Adrian gripped the steering wheel tightly as he drove toward Ethan's office. His mind was racing, but outwardly he was calm, eerily calm. It was a familiar feeling, one he had experienced many times before when he was on a mission. Only this time, it wasn't a battlefield in some far-off country. It was personal, closer to home than anything he had ever faced. He had rehearsed what he would say, but now, as he neared the office building where Ethan worked, he realized none of it mattered. No speech could sum up the rage, the betrayal, and the hurt he was feeling. This wasn't about carefully chosen words. This was about confronting a man who had helped destroy the life Adrian thought he knew. Adrian parked his truck, turned off the engine, and sat there for a moment. His heart was pounding, but his mind was clear. There was no turning back now. He had to do this for himself, for the truth, and for all the years he had been made a fool of. The building was busy, filled with people going about their day, oblivious to the storm brewing inside Adrian. As he made his way to the front desk, he asked to see Ethan. The receptionist smiled, unaware of the tension in Adrian's voice, and called up to his office. A few minutes later, Ethan appeared, his face all business as he approached Adrian, clearly not recognizing him at first. But then something shifted in Ethan's expression. It was subtle, a slight narrowing of his eyes, a flicker of recognition. Adrian could see it the moment Ethan realized who he was and why he was there. Adrian, right? Ethan said, trying to keep his voice calm, but the crack was there just below the surface. What brings you here? Adrian didn't bother with pleasantries. We need to talk, he said, his voice steady but firm. He didn't have to raise his voice to let Ethan know this wasn't a casual conversation. Ethan glanced around the lobby, clearly uncomfortable. Sure. Why don't we step into my office? He suggested, motioning toward the elevators. Adrian nodded, following him without a word. As they entered the office, Adrian took a moment to look around. It was just as polished and put together as Ethan's public persona, the successful boss, the professional. But Adrian knew the truth. He knew what kind of man Ethan really was. Ethan closed the door behind them, the sound echoing in the silence. He cleared his throat, trying to maintain control of the situation. So, what's this about? Adrian turned to face him, his eyes hard. You know exactly what this is about, he said, his voice low but full of meaning. For a moment, Ethan said nothing. He stood there staring at Adrian, trying to figure out his next move. But there was no escape. Adrian had him cornered, and they both knew it. I know about you and Lila, Adrian continued, his words slow and deliberate. I know everything, the affair, the lies, the sneaking around for over 20 years. Ethan's face paled. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He tried to hide it, but Adrian could see the panic in his eyes, the guilt washing over him like a wave. I don't want excuses, Adrian said, cutting him off before he could even start. I don't want to hear your side of the story. This isn't about you trying to explain yourself to me. This is about you knowing that I know. This is about you understanding what you've done. Ethan swallowed hard, finally finding his voice. Adrian, I didn't mean for any of this to happen. It just got out of hand. Adrian clenched his jaw, the familiar line echoing in his head. The same thing Lila had said. It just happened. Like they were both helpless passengers on a train that had somehow gone off the rails. 20 years, Adrian said, his voice cold. You don't just get out of hand for 20 years. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't some moment of weakness. This was a choice you made again and again for 2 decades. Ethan had no response. He stood there, shifting uncomfortably on his feet, unable to meet Adrian's gaze. The silence hung heavy in the air. Adrian took a step closer, his eyes locked on Ethan. You knew she was married. You knew exactly what you were doing. You didn't just betray her. You betrayed me. You disrespected me, my marriage, my life. Ethan finally looked up, his face a mixture of guilt and shame. I "I'm sorry," he muttered, the words barely audible. "Sorry," Adrian said, the bitterness creeping into his voice again. "Do you even understand what you've done? Do you have any idea what it's like to wake up one day and realize that the person you've loved and trusted for your entire life has been lying to you for 2 decades? Ethan's shoulders slumped, his head hanging low. He had no defense, no argument. Adrian wasn't there to fight him or to throw punches. He was there to make sure Ethan felt the weight of his actions, the weight of the life he had helped destroy. "You think you can just go on with your life after this?" Adrian asked, his voice cold and unforgiving. "You think you can just walk away like nothing happened?" Ethan didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. He had been caught, exposed, and there was no way to undo the damage he had caused. Adrian stood there for a moment longer, letting the silence fill the room. He wasn't looking for an apology. He wasn't looking for a way to make things right. He knew there was no going back. This wasn't about forgiveness. This was about justice, about making sure that Ethan understood the consequences of his actions. Finally, Adrian spoke again, his voice low but steady. "You will never come near my family again. You will never contact Lila, and you will stay out of my life, or you'll regret it." Ethan nodded, unable to look Adrian in the eyes. The fear was evident now, and Adrian could see that he understood. He knew that this wasn't a threat. It was a promise. Without another word, Adrian turned and walked out of the office, leaving Ethan standing there in silence, drowning in the consequences of his own choices. As Adrian stepped out into the cool air, he took a deep breath. For the first time in weeks, he felt a sense of control. The pain was still there, the betrayal still fresh, but now, at least, the truth was out. And with that truth came a strange kind of peace. This was just the beginning. There was still more to confront, more to deal with. But Adrian had taken the first step, and that was enough for now. As Adrian drove away from Ethan's office, a strange sense of calm washed over him. The anger was still there, burning just beneath the surface, but now it felt controlled, almost like a weapon he could wield with precision. He wasn't the type to lash out or make impulsive decisions, not after all the years of discipline he had learned as a Marine. No, his revenge would be different. It would be measured, calculated. He had no intention of hurting anyone physically, but emotionally, that was a different story. He wanted Lila to feel the weight of her choices. He wanted her to understand with every fiber of her being what she had thrown away. And Ethan? He would get his too, in ways that would cut deeper than any punch Adrian could throw. It started with the house, the home he had built with Lila, the one they had shared for over 30 years. Adrian had always handled the finances, and Lila had never paid much attention to the details. She didn't know that, in the past few months, Adrian had taken steps to ensure that the house would be his alone. He had quietly removed her name from the deed, transferring everything into his name. She wouldn't have noticed. She was too busy living her double life to care about paperwork. Now, with the affair exposed, Adrian wasn't going to let her stay in the home that he had worked so hard to build. She had chosen her path, and it didn't include him. So he made sure she had no way to come back. When the time was right, he would present her with the papers, the final blow that would leave her with nothing. But that wasn't all. Adrian knew that Lila's entire identity was wrapped up in her social circle, the image she had carefully crafted over the years, the perfect wife, the successful professional. But that image was built on lies, and Adrian was ready to tear it down piece by piece. He started by reaching out to a few key people in their lives, friends they had shared for years. He didn't tell them the whole story, just enough to plant the seed. Quiet conversations, subtle hints. He didn't need to scream the truth from the rooftops. He knew that rumors, once started, had a way of spreading all on their own. It didn't take long for the whispers to start. People began asking questions, and soon, Lila's carefully constructed world started to crumble around her. Her friends, the ones she thought would always stand by her, began to pull away. They didn't want to be associated with the scandal. They didn't want to be part of her lies. Adrian watched it all unfold from a distance. He didn't take any joy in it, not really. But there was a sense of justice in watching her face the consequences of her actions. She had spent years lying to him, living a life that wasn't real. Now, she was the one being left behind. Ethan wasn't spared either. Adrian knew that Ethan's career was built on his reputation, his image as a successful, respectable man in the community. But that image was fragile, and Adrian knew exactly how to break it. He didn't go after Ethan's job directly. That wasn't his style. Instead, he went after his connections, people who mattered to Ethan, the ones who held influence in his world. Adrian made sure those people knew the truth. He didn't have to say much, just enough to let them see Ethan for who he really was. The affair wasn't just a personal betrayal. It was a reflection of Ethan's character, and in the business world, Character mattered. Slowly, the doors that had always been open to Ethan began to close. Business deals that were once certain fell through. Invitations to important events stopped coming. It wasn't dramatic, not at first, but over time it became clear that Ethan's reputation was tarnished, his standing in the community forever changed. Adrian didn't need to see the fallout to know it was happening. He had done what he came to do, expose the truth and make sure there was no way for Ethan to come out of it unscathed. In the end, it wasn't about destroying lives. It was about ensuring that those who had wronged him faced the consequences of their actions. It was about justice, not revenge. But even as he told himself that, Adrian couldn't deny the satisfaction he felt in watching it all unfold. The pain Lila and Ethan had caused him was deep, and it would take time to heal. But knowing that they were paying for their choices in real, tangible ways brought him a sense of closure that he desperately needed. Adrian's life would never be the same. He had been betrayed in the worst possible way by the person he had trusted the most. But now, as he stood on the other side of it all, he realized that this wasn't the end. It was a new beginning, a chance to rebuild his life on his own terms, without the lies, without the betrayal. Lila and Ethan had made their choices. Now, they had to live with them. And Adrian, he was finally free. The days that followed felt different. For the first time in what seemed like forever, Adrian wasn't consumed by thoughts of betrayal. The anger had started to fade, replaced by a strange kind of emptiness, but also relief. It wasn't the kind of relief that came with forgetting, because he knew he'd never fully forget. But it was the kind that came with acceptance. The acceptance that life doesn't always turn out the way you expect, and sometimes you have to let go of the past to find peace. Adrian moved out of the house he had shared with Lila. It was his now legally, but it didn't feel like home anymore. Too many memories were tied up in those walls, and most of them were tainted. Instead, he found a small place on the edge of town, a modest cabin with enough space for just him and his thoughts. It was quiet there, peaceful, just what he needed. His mornings were simple. Coffee on the porch, the sun rising over the trees. He found comfort in the routine, in the solitude. For the first time in years, Adrian didn't feel like he was living someone else's life. He wasn't trying to fit into a mold that no longer suited him. He was just himself, and that was enough. Sam, the friend who had shown him the truth, stayed in touch. They met up every now and then, shared stories, laughed over beers. It was good to have someone who understood, someone who had been through the same kind of pain. They didn't talk about Lila or the affair much anymore. There was no need. The storm had passed, and Adrian was ready to move on. It wasn't easy, though. There were still nights when the loneliness crept in, when he'd think back to the life he thought he had and wonder how it had all gone so wrong. But those nights were becoming fewer. Each day, Adrian found himself thinking less about the past and more about the future, his future. He started working with Sam at the retreat, helping other men who had gone through similar betrayals. It wasn't something Adrian had ever pictured himself doing, but he found it fulfilling in a way he hadn't expected. Sharing his story, listening to others, offering advice when he could. It gave him a sense of purpose, a way to turn his pain into something that could help others heal. One day, as he was packing up his things at the end of a session, a man approached him. He was younger, probably in his early 30s, and he looked nervous, like he wasn't sure if he should speak up. Adrian smiled, encouraging him to talk. "Hey, I just wanted to say thanks," the man said, shifting awkwardly. "Hearing your story, it helped me. A lot." Adrian nodded, feeling a warmth he hadn't felt in a long time. "I'm glad," he said simply. "It's a tough road, but you'll get through it. We all do." As the man walked away, Adrian felt something settle inside him. He had been through hell, but he was still standing, and now he was helping others find their way out of the darkness too. In the end, that was what mattered. Not the revenge, not the hurt, not even the betrayal. What mattered was that he had survived, and now he was building something new, something real. He wasn't the same man he had been before the affair. That version of Adrian was gone, and in his place stood someone stronger, wiser, more in tune with what really mattered in life. He had lost a lot, but he had gained something even more valuable, himself. As the sun set on another quiet evening at the cabin, Adrian sat on the porch, watching the sky turn shades of pink and orange. For the first time in a long time, he felt at peace. His journey wasn't over, but he was on the right path, and that was enough. Lila and Ethan were part of his past, a painful chapter in his life. But they didn't define him anymore. Adrian had reclaimed his story, and now he was writing the next chapter, one filled with hope, healing, and the promise of a new beginning.